Welcome to another episode of Trees and Lines. Sig Guggenmoos, president at Ecological Solutions Incorporated, joins us to talk about his clear width calculator, the relationship between cycle and reliability, and more. Have a listen. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, Sig. Really appreciate your joining us for today's podcast.
Happy to do so.
Yeah. You reminded me not long ago that we've known each other for about 40 years. But not everybody that's listening may know you. So how about a little bit of background? Tell us who you are and what you're doing these days.
Okay. So name is Sig Guggenmoos, and background is, like some of your other interviewees, kind of fell into this business a little accidentally. I went to the University of Guelph, actually to take a degree in wildlife and fisheries. But after completing my first year, I had met a fellow who was in the graduating class in wildlife and fisheries, and he was one of two people out of a class of 22 that had gotten a job. So a career change was planned for me. This didn't look good. So instead, I did a degree in horticulture. And I ended up working in summer jobs, horticultural research, under Dr. Gus Turani, and I found research really appealing. I really enjoyed that. And that gave me a good introduction to statistics. Back in the days when we didn't have computers, well, computers were punch card type things, and so we did analysis of variance all by hand. And I left university for a period of years and then decided I'd go back and complete my degree. And on doing so, that next summer, I got a job with Dr. Jerry Stevenson doing herbicide research on Ontario hydro right-of-ways. And that's kind of what started me down this path. And back then, I was working with a product called Dowco 233, which you now know as Garlon. And so I found the research really interesting. Upon graduating in 1977, my plan was to do graduate work. However, Dr. Jerry Stevenson was taking a sabbatical for a year. So I thought, well, I'll just kind of hang around the university, or unless I see some plum jobs, apply for them. Well, I saw what looked like a plum job for Amchem involving research. And in that interview, I met Roy Johnson. Well, I didn't get that job. I came second in the competition, but they really liked me. And so they hooked me up with a contracting company that they had an ownership stake in. And so I took that job with the contracting company, and we were doing work for utilities, railroads, counties, that sort of thing, vegetation management. And I worked in the railroad division then. After that, after a year, when Jerry Stevenson came back from his sabbatical, I had so much enjoyed working for this small contracting company that I said, no, I want to stick with this, and never returned to it. So that's kind of my educational background. And I mentioned some of my mentors, Dr. Gus Turani, Dr. Jerry Stevenson. Roy Johnson became a great mentor to me. And then there was Tom Plett of Conrail, and subsequently, I worked with Neil Thiessen, and he was a mentor. So I ended up in the contracting world, and our contracting company was located in Ontario, but we were bought by a Calgary firm in 1979. And after operating us there, carrying on for a year, they decided they would move us from Ontario to Alberta, where they already had a division that was in vegetation management for utilities, and combined us into a company called Ace Vegetation Control Service and asked me to be the general manager, which I accepted. And so that took me to Alberta. Some years later, TransAlta came looking for me, and Phil, you're familiar with this because how that came about was ECI had done a study for TransAlta utilities. And so one of the pieces of advice they had was they should get some more professional staff on board. So they basically headhunted me. And so I ended up at TransAlta, and I was there for 10 years. I left TransAlta when I was put in a bit of an unusual circumstance. our CEO was very interested in the whole greenhouse gas thing because Transalt at the time, I think we were something like 92% of the generation was coal-fired. And he could see the way things were going with greenhouse gas issues, that there may come regulations that had dramatic impact on TransAlta's business. So he wanted to get kind of ahead of the curve. So I was being chased to take part in working on greenhouse gas issues. However, the forestry group didn't want to let me go. Well, after about 8 months of resisting this, I realized, like, how long before the CEO just makes a declaration that I'm I'm working on greenhouse gas issues, and my responsibilities for forestry would continue at the same time. So I offered to leave the company on contract back to both groups, and that's how I ended up consulting, and started that in 1995. So over the last 20 years or so, well, there's more than that now, but for the last 20 years, what I've really been focused on is working with utilities where I'm supplying data and information, which they in turn then supply to the regulator to inform general tariff applications, to look at vegetation management program effectiveness, and it'll look for areas of improvement, specifically with respect to costs and reliability. So that's kind of it. That's
you.
Where I've
Good.
been and where it takes me up to present.
Yeah, well, good. I was going to say you worked with Hugo Shaw and Neil Thiessen for many years, those 10 years at least, I guess, and
Yes.
three guys that have made a huge impact on our industry, each in their own way. So that's pretty cool. And I know you like research because I've been working for a couple utilities and interested in improving reliability by shortening their cycle. And I do some research, and your name comes up time and time and time again. You've done some great stuff, Sig. But respond to that question. What should they expect if they're shortening their cycle to improve reliability?
When you look at reliability, you kind of have to break it down. Are you looking at, so trees causing outages, are they first a gross categorization? Are they fall-ins or are they grow-ins? So the cycle, if you're looking at pruning cycles, then you have to break that down again. If you are not in a situation where you have mandated clearance requirements, and you're not in a fire-prone area, and you don't have trees that I look at it that they give off volatile oils, trees like eucalyptus. Now, we've all seen, if we've been around this industry for a while, you've seen trees growing up into a conductor, and you might see a little bit of sparking, and there's a gap, like maybe a 1/4 inch, and it sparks across. And typically what happens is that heats up that tender growth, it desiccates it, and it just stops the growth and nothing happens. However, if you have trees like eucalypts, it immediately bursts into flames, and I mean roaring flames. So if you have that situation, then it's different than the situation where it's okay that you can have them grow up. Now, shortening the cycle with trees growing up, you don't have those eucalypts. You're not in a fire-prone area, and you don't have mandated clearance requirements. In that case, well, it's hard to say what you're going to gain out of shortening your cycle. It's only if you get so far behind that then you get caught up and basically hot spotting the system. But there's a place where you could allow a certain amount of the trees growing into the conductors, because it's only going to cause an outage when you have a substantial bridge between phases, or it's growing up between the phases, nothing's happening until the wind blows, and between the movement of the trees and the conductors, you end up with phases slapping together. But it's not, it's not really going to cause an outage for you. So there's that. If you're in a fire-prone area, then you need to be cautious. If you get a good enough size let's say you've got something that at the base is, or at a breast height is about 4 inches, and it's moving over into a conductor. Now you could have arcing down at ground level, and if you're in a fire-prone area, you don't want that. So it depends. Each utility's got to look at what their situation is.
Could you simplify for maybe the audience, like you talk about, utilities that may not have, mandated requirements, right? Or areas that may not have mandated requirements. Like I would assume, or I would expect, maybe this is a naive thought, but that we're at a place where requirements are almost established across the board in varying degrees. Like take fire prone out of it, because I get that part, but maybe give us an example of a part of the country or a particular space that doesn't have those requirements.
I'll give you first. Like, so I'm in the province of Alberta, and we have mandated clearance requirements. A distance, there's a minimum distance that trees are allowed to approach a conductor that have to be maintained all the time. It's kind of like what our NERC standard does on transmission, but this applies also to distribution. California has mandated clearance requirements. The state of Oregon has one, a little bit different approach in that theirs has to do with whether or not you can climb the tree and so on. But in those cases, you have a limit of approach so that a tree can get to the line, and you need to maintain that. California will actually go out, they have people go out and look to see if you are in violation and find the utility. In Alberta, they don't really go out and hunt for those situations. In fact, when I was at TransAlta, we turned it around the other way, because if we would have an uncooperative landowner and wouldn't allow us to do the pruning, we would notify the electrical protection branch that we had the situation that was now broaching the limits of approach, and the landowner would not allow us to do anything about it. And then they would go, the electrical protection branch would send that landowner a letter saying that should something happen there, that the landowner is now equally liable with the utility for any damages. So that usually scared them enough to get cooperation. We usually got a call like, "Could you get a crew here right now?" So that's the difference. And in other cases, other states, like, they don't have a requirement, a minimum distance required between trees and the line.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
vast majority of utilities don't operate under required clearances.
Got it.
Right.
Sig, I forgot to also mention on this that you're our first. Well, I'm Canadian, and you're our first Canadian guest, I believe. So, celebratory moment there.
Yeah.
As a fellow Canadian, talk a little bit about your time in consulting. Like, you've done a lot of work for a lot of different utilities. It seems like a bulk of them are on the West Coast, right? Like from Puget to some of the Canadian players.
Well, no, not necessarily.
Or have you been across the board?
I did some major work with National Grid back. That was actually during the period I was working with them when the big blackout happened in the Northeast, and I was just praying that it did not, before I heard where it started, I was just praying it did not occur on National Grid system.
Oh no! Oh man!
but it did not. It was not. It was not there. But it definitely got the point across that how important electricity is to us, and that vegetation can be a major issue.
We consultants did a lot of prayer that night.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, everybody wondering who was the one.
Yeah. In terms of cycles, it depends. Now, I've been working with a client on growth studies over the last since 2015, and what we're doing is we're having trim crews provide data when they're doing the pruning, and we've got it divided into 3 eco zones, segregated, whether it's crown growth or lateral growth, species, and they look back as far as 5 years in terms of growth recorded. And there's some interesting things that come out of that. When you look at what the maximum amount of growth is and look at the mean growth that we have. And there, by the way, we've got over 6,000 records in that database now. And you look at the mean growth and you divide the mean growth into the maximum observed over since we've collected the data, like by species and by ecozone and by top or side trim. You end up with numbers ranging from 200 to 700%, which tells you that growth is highly variable. And so I look at it, you can have a timed cycle. However, you're going to need to modify it by getting a condition assessment. In terms of the timing for distribution, because of this variability in the growth, and by the way, 20 to 30% of the locations, if you look at what the number is for the upper confidence level, you've got 20 to 30% above the upper confidence level, again, suggesting to you, you're going to need a condition assessment. Now, if you're in that situation where you don't have the requirements for distance between trees and lines mandated for you, then in that case, what I would suggest is you look at, okay, what is the mean growth that we have? Divide that into the clearance you obtain on pruning. That gives you a beginning point. Then, instead of taking the mean growth, go one standard deviation above. That basically says to you, about 16% of the trees are going to be in the line before you get there on the next cycle. And that strikes me as a reasonable amount, and you can do that on distribution, as I say, if you don't have that mandated clearance requirements and you're not in a fire zone.
I'll confirm that. University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point did a benchmark, and I believe the average contact at the time of the tree work was 21%. So you're pretty close.
Okay. Yeah. On transmission, there you're looking at a different standard. And so what I would suggest to get that starting point on transmission is to go 2 standard deviations above, leaving you roughly 2.5%. And even that, because transmissions, you really don't want any outages there. So then you're going to have to go and inspect to find where's that 2.5% or 2.2% that we need to pick up. One of the big things in terms of shorter cycles is because now between my work and what I've seen in the literature, you end up with, on distribution systems, tree caused outages being or I should say the grow-ins being 2 to 25% of all the tree caused outages. The corollary of that is that 76 to 98% of the outages are caused by tree failures. And then you're going to need to separate, like, what kind of tree failure? Is it a branch failure? Is it trunk failure? Is it uprooting? And there, I've written about, one thing I forgot to mention in my background is that I wrote for, I think it was 6 years, for Transmission Distribution World, doing a monthly article. And in there, I set out, really, utilities should be gathering a lot of data in terms of the types of outages, relying on the servicemen when they go and re-energize. Well, to them, if it's green all year round, it's a pine. There's no distinctions made. It's a pine. And they won't give you the species information. They can't really give you the details that you want. So you need to send an arborist out. And I recognize, on distribution, there may be a lot of these, and it becomes pretty time consuming. But you can set a priority to say, like, okay, we're going to send an arborist out to investigate, outages that occur between the substation and the first protective device, for example, or make it somewhat broader than that. But to gather information that gives you what was the type of failure, what was the species, how far, was it in right of way, outside the right of way, how far away was the tree from the conductor? And I'll tell you, some of the information that I've picked up doing inventories for utilities is that generally when someone's looking from the outside, driving the road or from walking the right of way and looking at the trees, the percent of hazard trees that you find is about 2%. However, because I look at, when I do inventories, I want the full utility forest. So I have people go 10 feet inside the adjacent forest and gather data there about the trees. And one of the things is to look for defects. What we found there was that when you do that, 11 to up to 30%, or actually it was over 30% of the trees inside the forest show some level of decadence. So in other words, utilities do a great job of identifying hazard trees along the edge, but how deep does that go? It doesn't extend to beyond 10 feet inside the forest. And so if you start looking inside the forest, you're going to find more hazard trees. You need information like that. And again, all of this stuff becomes very useful in terms of communicating with the regulator. Do you want us to send someone out and inspect all the trees, to take the time and the expense to do that? And
I got to imagine the answer is no.
Well, the difficulty there, Tej, is I don't know that many utilities have done it. Now, I just recently did some work in West Virginia, and I was informed there that their transmission group actually did do some of that, basically for their own information, to inform them in terms of what is the difference. And it's pretty substantial. But there's bound to be a huge cost to doing that, having someone walk in. And I've seen utilities, play that, we expect our contractors to check all the trees. Well, let's look specifically at the wording in the contract. Is it clearly set out that they are to inspect all the trees? And if not, then you're not likely getting that, and you're not paying for it. So be honest, like if you're a utility, be honest. Have you got that stated that they inspect every tree that on failure could contact a conductor? So yeah, so in a certain sense, if you wanted to do that, you could tremendously improve your hazard tree program, and that would have a big impact on reliability.
Are you, when you mention inventory, I'm guessing I saw that you have been doing a lot of work with LiDAR, geospatial data, et cetera. So are you then taking a lot of the data that the utility is gathering and analyzing it, processing it? Like, how are you going about doing an evaluation for the utility and then also factoring in their budget requirements to give them a more optimal solution? Because obviously, like, some of the things that you're talking about, going 10 feet in, doing a full assessment of where the true risks are, there always seems to be a mismatch between what the PUCs understand and what their budgets are being allocated to the utility for versus what the actual problem is. And then it becomes a dollar Tetris. So how are you going about sort of optimizing that whole thing for the utility so they get best outcome?
I look at it that there's a certain amount of work that you need to do every year. And I borrowed this really from forestry. In forestry, you have an annual volume increment. So this is guys looking at production in the forest. There's an annual volume increment. Well, and I coined the term utility forest because we need to recognize, that we're dealing with the same things for different reasons, but we're dealing with a system that's the same. And so there's an annual volume increment of work that occurs that you need to be addressing every year. If not, you're falling behind. And what my research has shown is the nature of that expansion. It's a logistic progression, which is to say it follows an S curve. So it starts off slow, but beyond a certain point, you have a period of exponential expansion, and then it levels off at the top. In other words, it's as bad as it could get when you get to the top. Right. Yeah. And that's how I go about it. But I have not, I've used LiDAR data in terms of setting out for utilities where This takes me into another topic, which is I developed a system that I call the optimal clear width calculator, and the output is called the risk factor. And so what I do is develop a risk factor by span, by side for companies along their lines. And so far, this work I've done only on behalf of transmission companies, and that's where I've used LiDAR. But I haven't in terms of when it comes to doing the inventory. I subcontract work to crews going out, actually doing measurements in the fields, and it's sampled, it's sampling across the electric system to get the data. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Interesting.
And Ted, you just took me into another topic there in terms of, what really causes, where do tree-related outages come from? And it's basically the major thing is tree exposure. The utilities I've worked with, when it comes to growing outages, it's been what I've seen is growing outages are responsible for 2 to 5% of the tree-related outages. So the vast majority are coming from some form of tree failure. And then the utilities that actually collect that data that I suggested, should be collected subsequent to a tree failure, send an arborist out and get that information. What they found was 70% of those tree failure outages would not have been prevented had they gone out the day before and seen that tree. They would not have deemed it a hazard tree. So basically, tree-related outages are coming from the amount of tree exposure. Now, I've done work with 2 different transmission systems and looked at, and transmission was great for this because let's look at it. How does transmission control the amount of tree-related outages? Wider right-of-ways, taller structures, which basically means greater clearance between conductors and ground. Is there a difference in the tree-related outage experience between voltage classes? Well, pretty well everyone who works on a transmission system can say yes, there is. So then I looked at, okay, so what are the factors that make up for this difference? And I, by the way, it isn't just the width of the right-of-way. Specifically, I'm interested in what's the clearance between the outside conductor and the tree trunks on the forest edge, which I call the clear width. So does clear width account for that difference between the voltage in the outage experience between these voltage classes? Well, the correlation there was sometimes yes, sometimes no. That depended on how big a difference did you have between the voltage classes. So in other words, if you had, let's say for 69 kV, you had a 50-foot right-of-way, which might have given you, let's say 30 some odd feet clear width. But the 115, you had 120-foot right-of-way and you had the 70-foot clear width. So you had a big difference between the two. In that case, yes, there was a correlation. What other factors do we have? What about the line height? No, didn't come up as significant. What about tree height? Didn't come up as significant. Now, the reason being is because in sampling, you've got tree height this much at one place, and the next place is another tree height, so it's variable all over. And so that wasn't significant. I lump all of these things together and add one more thing. So I look at line height, tree height, clear width, and tree density. How many trees per acre do you have? Which is part of that information we get from work in the forest. And that creates a risk factor. And that risk factor was found to have a tremendously strong correlation to the outage experience. The only other one that had a really strong correlation to the outage experience was the number of trees, the total number of trees per voltage class miles.
Wait a minute.
So in other words, it's tree exposure, the total number of trees per mile of that voltage class.
Okay.
Yeah. So both of those things is a risk factor, and the one is a direct amount exposure, the trees per mile, and the risk factor is a more detailed risk exposure in that it also factors in if you look at the trees along the side, what's the angle? Like if they could hit the line, do they need to fall at, like, it'd be very small risk if they needed to fall exactly 90 degrees. But if they're closer to the line, then you have this arc of exposure that the line has. The risk factor accounts for that. Well, and with that, I was able to develop a regression equation that found that basically that explained that difference in tree-related outage experience between the voltage classes and makes it predictable. And it accounted it, or I should say, that the R squared value was over 0.95. So for those who don't know statistics or have forgotten their statistics, what that implies is that there's less than 5%. If you identify another variable, it's got to be less than 5%, which means it's not significant. So in other words, that tree height, line height, clear width, and tree density have captured the majority of the variables you need to determine what the risk is. And with that, what you can do is look at, what if we widen the right of way? Can we, reduce that tree exposure, lower that tree exposure? What is the improvement in reliability that we can expect? And you can accomplish that with that, or you could look at, what if we increase the height of the line? What will that do? And for those sorts of things, I've been able to use LiDAR data to come up with things like that.
In a steady state environment, like the data that you're looking at, that obviously doesn't account for event, right? So if the forest and its state changes because a storm came through, and even though it didn't knock out a bunch of trees, it's changed their health maybe in some way, shape, or form. Your study and your data, it changes, obviously, right?
Right.
So like if you've now put a utility, you've given them the risk factor, they've built a plan around it, the budget has flowed, storm hits in year 2, you'd have to kind of recalibrate based on your risk profile to adjust that.
I'll tell you a good thing about that is, if you're looking at, let's say you widen the right of way, okay, that applies even during storms.
Okay.
That benefit applies even during storms. Now, the thing is, if you widen the right of way, in that case, you need to widen it substantially because you've created a new edge.
Yeah.
And so trees now are more vulnerable to failure because they have not experienced that loading that you're now exposing them to. So for a period of, I look at it like 5 to 8 years, there's a higher risk of trees failing on the edge and coming into the line. So you need to make the change big enough that while you have more trees failing and falling into the right of way, they're not hitting the conductor on doing so. So in other words, that arc of exposure that I said, you need to narrow it down so much that you can have trees falling off the side of that. But, so you have to balance it out that way. And yes, and the conditions, Ted, you mentioned the conditions changed. When I did work for Puget Sound Energy, and we looked at wind loading and things too. And we took a 10-year time slice and said, okay, if the next 10 years was like the last 10 years, then we could predict this. But obviously, there's going to be some variables. And so by the same token, you can't go and take what was done for Puget Sound Energy and go apply it to another utility, because your tree species are going to be different. The weather conditions that you have are going to be different, and so on.
Yep.
The principle remains, but
yeah,
the specifics vary.
Sig, I'm really enjoying this analytical breakdown of how you think about risk and how you've quantified it and can communicate, with all the different variables. Here's a question for you. You've been in this industry a long time. Is there somebody out there like, Sig's nemesis that has a completely different approach or refutes kind of the work that you do because, they've got a different theory, a different approach, looking, generating different results? Or is everybody generally kind of operating in the same sphere, but just slicing the pie a little differently?
I don't see anybody that has a totally different approach. I mean, there's people that say, oh, they can provide utilities with risk evaluation along their lines and so on. I don't see anyone that has done the level of work that I've done in terms of defining that risk. So yes, people, you can go and take satellite imagery or LiDAR imagery and say you got so many trees along your line, but you haven't combined all those variables that I do. And as you've seen, Tej, I'm big on numbers and statistics.
Yep.
That's the approach that I like. And I had a client that put me in touch with someone who was wanting to get into this business, and they were looking at it that they were going to do, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. And this was going to be a great thing, and they're going to be able to sell it to utilities. And I pointed out to them that the variability is so great. Oh, well, okay. I said, in terms of the growth studies, the variability is so great. How are you going to do that? I mean, the statistics say you can't just predict it. You have such variability. We're going to incorporate weather, we're going to incorporate soil, and so on. I said, yeah. And given that I worked on greenhouse gas issues, I can tell you in soil, you have variability. Move 30 feet, and it's totally different. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to incorporate all of that?
Yeah.
So
I'm with you.
I don't know. And consequently, if someone comes up with something, I want to see it field verified. I'll give you an example from that. When the LiDAR providers first came, really started coming onto the scene in the early 2000s, they were very impressed with. They now had the resolution down to this small amount. We're talking, centimeters. So that's great. However, what I wanted to find out was, okay, you've done the scan. Have you gone back out in the field and checked how accurate was the scan? Because yes, your technology gives it the 2 centimeters, but what's working in the background is all these algorithms. So I need to know how good is your algorithm. and not everyone does that. Not everyone goes out to the field to verify the accuracy of the algorithms they're using.
Sig, I'll tell you, the first research project I worked on was a right-of-way, and the field crews were pacing a distance and writing it down to the 10th of a foot. And I always thought, there's just a mismatch. Somebody needs to be verifying the data.
Yeah.
Something that interests me very much, and I'm just starting to obviously Phil to me is, a repository like yourself of so much information, so much history in this space. When we think about carbon sequestration, we start thinking about the right of way as an asset rather than just a liability. Start to think about, carbon value of the footprint. So, hey, right of way X that utility A owns is worth the equivalent of, I'm just throwing a number out there, $20 million, based on its carbon credit value versus this right of way. And we've cleared $5 million of that value this year, and et cetera. Your work obviously centers around risk. How much of your work now has also tied into that side of it? The environmental preservation of the right of way, value.
Yeah. It hasn't, Tej, although interestingly, I don't know how many utilities have done this, but I did that. I told you, that I'd left. I went consulting because I was being chased by the CEO to do work on greenhouse gas issues. And one of the things we did was to look at right away in terms of carbon sequestration. And it turned out very, very positive. And we thought environmental groups would give us a good pat on the back for doing that kind of work, but no, we got nothing for it.
Nothing. Right. Yeah.
But yes, now you look at it, if you're putting in a new right of way, you're removing this biomass. So there's a big drop at the outset. But as time goes on, like with the approach of letting shrubs, grasses and shrubs grow, it's actually very good. It's a positive. And in terms of, went back in my TransAlta days, we looked at right-of-ways and environmentally too. We had greater species diversity and abundance on our right-of-ways, then, for example, this was on distribution. So we'd have the line on one side of the roadway, and we'd be maintaining that. On the other side, the county, for example, would be maintaining it and doing whatever they did. And we had greater species diversity and abundance on the areas we maintained than what appeared on the county side, which typically was just dealt with by mowing.
Sig, I could do this all day with you. I mean, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a lot of your work and impact and research. So I know that we've covered a lot today, but we should do a continuation of this discussion. I don't know about you, Phil, but
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by Sig's
a researcher, and it always comes through.
Oh yeah, his view is super interesting and very. I'm a math guy, so I like things quantified, the statistics side of things. I think this is the first conversation I've had where you have this level of granularity in terms of the data. So super interested to kind of continue to explore stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of other topics to get into, like I mentioned Neil Thiessen that I worked for being one of my mentors. And so he was fabulous in terms of customer relations. So that's a whole other area to talk about. One of the other big areas is in terms of relationships between utilities and the regulator. And I what I've seen is an attitude of, well, they're against us, and so they're really scared. Or if we buy them enough lunches, we'll get cooperation. And I look at it, neither one of those is really effective, and there's a whole area of discussion, how to approach the regulator, because I've had what I look at as success. Now, even in terms of, like, I'll give you an example. If the regulator, you come up with a proposal, as I did for Puget Sound Energy, where if we go out and remove what amount? I think it was something like 8% of the total tree exposure. It was about 380,000 trees. If we identify the areas, and this is that stuff with the risk factor. Where's the areas of high risk, and let's shift those to lower the risk, and as a consequence, there's an overall benefit to the system. We could obtain a 42% reduction in tree-related outages, which would apply in good weather or bad weather. And the regulator said, well, 380,000 trees, and if we approve this, gosh, we're going to get the phone calls. So no thanks. Don't do it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the utility, okay, they've been told not to do this. You've offered, a solution to the issue. Now it's not the utility's fault.
Yeah. Well, I think we should reserve hopefully some time with you and maybe focus on some of these topics, the customer service side of things, and that PU's, the regulator and utility dynamic, because it's important, especially now. What we're seeing right now in this climate, regulators have been pretty aggressively rejecting initial rate cases, and the utilities have gone back to the drawing board and have to, solve for this much work with this much money.
Right.
And so, how utilities are choosing now to prioritize the risk profiles haven't necessarily changed, but their ability to execute and manage that risk with limited resources, of course, has. So I definitely would love to talk more about how your recommendations are shifting based on this different environment, right? One thing we noticed, of course, is a fire takes place, a storm takes place. There's a correlation to budget expansion, right? Everybody doesn't want to end up on a newspaper, and so, but as things have kind of calmed down over the last 3 or 4 years, budgets have as well. And so, but in order to prevent from getting back into those complicated situations, you've got to continue to do the right things. And so I'm always curious how someone like you, who has so many years of experience, has the data, when you see the shift in money, how much does the variability of your recommendation shift?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a teaser, Tej, where I have an example of a utility.
Yeah.
That I went to them. They wanted to talk about risk, and they had problems in terms of a general tariff application. And I said, it's going to take some time, but I'm going to get you data. And what we're going to do is we're going to transfer the responsibility to the regulator if they do not want to address this.
Mhm.
Wow.
They will be scared. And the day after the rate case was done, the VP called me up and he said, Sig, you're right. They were scared. They agreed to every recommendation you made.
Yeah. That fear will definitely drive certain levels of outcome. That's for sure. Well, this was awesome, Sig. Like I said, let's find some more time to continue the dialogue over a couple of more episodes. I don't know, Phil, if you have anything else you want to tackle today.
No, I'd love that. Well,
Yeah.
no, I
There's just
one
so
at a
much to
time,
talk about
let's-
with Sig, and
Yeah.
it was an absolute pleasure to just get through this today. This was amazing. So really
So
enjoyed
how
it.
many years have you been out of Transalta Consulting?
I left there. I set up the consulting business in 1995.
Oh, okay.
So it's what almost 30 years
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. No, this is great. Sig, you really kind of really innovative way of thinking about things. Congrats on all the great work that you've done and the impact you've had on the space. Pretty impressive.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time today, Sig, and we will follow up.
Definitely.
It'd be great
Yeah.
to have you back.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.